So today I wanted to take a look at the textual variant in Matthew chapter 18, verse 11. So if you are, I think most of you who watch the channel here are probably acutely aware that there's a number of verses, entire verses, which are contested, we'll say, right? The Textus Receptus has these, the King James Version, the New King James Version, but then you come over to the modern translations and they don't have these verses, and there's about 16 altogether. I'm not a King James Version onlyist. However, a number of these verses, like these 16 verses that we often talk about, I think what happens is sometimes somebody say, well, it's just the King James Version guys who do that, and so I can discount them altogether, and these 16 verses aren't really part of Scripture. And I want to just say, hold on, let's not swing the pendulum all the way to that side of the error, okay? Just because the King James Version onlyists think that we should retain all of these 16 verses doesn't mean that we should automatically dismiss them either. So I'm coming to the position of a Byzantine prioritist, and just at a quick outlook, if you saw the live stream a few, like a month now, I went through the 16, and I think out of the 16, 11 of them, aside from the 1 John 5, 7, and 8, 11 of them are still retained in the Byzantine text. So part of what I'm doing here is this is kind of the beginning of a series where I'm going to go through each one of those textual variants, those 16 whole verse variants, and just go through them and see why our brothers who advocate for modern translations, why they would see those as not being part of Scripture. And then, of course, I'll probably add some sort of Byzantine apology. Yeah, that's it. Apology for why we should retain most of those. So again, today we're going to be taking a look at Matthew chapter 18, verse 11. For those who don't know what it is, I'll just read it here from the New King James Version. It's Matthew 18, verse 11. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. You'll notice here in the list of Bible translations that I have the New American Standard Bible 95, which seems to have the passage, for the Son of Man has come to save that which is lost. But if you actually open it, let's get rid of this. I'm sorry, it's really big. You'll notice it's in square brackets. So why is it in square brackets? Well, it's in square brackets because, well, the editors of the NASB don't believe that it's actually part of Scripture. And so they have a footnote here. The footnote here says, early manuscripts do not contain this variant. And it's interesting that they say early manuscripts do not contain this variant, because what you actually find is there are, depending on how you define early, at least one early manuscript which does contain it. Plus the Old Latin and the Vulgate and all that kind of stuff. So again, like Mark 16, 9 through 20, right? The notes here are problematic. And you see this in many of the other versions as well. So the NIV doesn't contain it at all. Like it just, if you come to that verse 11 just doesn't exist, and it skips right to verse 12. So the note here says, some manuscripts include here the words of Luke 19:10, but that's not true. It does not contain necessarily the form of the verse found in Luke 19:10. And again, we'll go over that. This is a really interesting variant. So text comparison. I have Scrivener's text here. The New Living Translation, again, I don't like it. It's too dynamic, but anyway. So if we come down to verse 11, of course, verse 11 is totally gone. Like the verse indicator isn't there. And we have a little asterisk, and that's going to tell us why. And it says, some manuscripts add verse 11, and the Son of Man came to save those who are lost. Compare Luke 19:10. So again, some manuscripts. When they say some manuscripts, okay, this is one of those verses that are in Textual Textvert. So it's been fully collated, and I think it was 87%, based on the text critical Greek New Testament. 87% of manuscripts, Greek manuscripts, contain this passage. 87%. Like it's not just a majority; it's like a super majority. So some manuscripts is a little bit. Yeah, I understand why they do it, but it's misleading. The ASV has it. Now, I don't know if there's any footnotes or anything like that with it, but I was surprised to see that, because the ASV is basically a Westcott and Hort translation of the New Testament. So the CSB here, we're going to go to Matthew 18:9, because I don't know why it doesn't have verse 10. That's strange to me. But skips verse 11, so it goes straight from verse 10 to verse 12. Let me put this. Can I put this up higher? No, I can't. Okay. And then when you take a look at the footnote, again, you're left with some manuscripts include verse 11, for the Son of Man has come to save that law. Again, same thing, some manuscripts. When they say some manuscripts here, what they're really referring to is like a super majority of manuscripts. So really, if it was to be accurate, I think it should say most manuscripts. But of course, the problem with that, and I think part of the reason, I'm trying to be charitable here, why they say some manuscripts is because they don't want to give the impression that a multitude of manuscripts or a majority of manuscripts is a deciding factor. Now, we would agree that a majority of manuscripts isn't necessarily a deciding factor, but also a super majority, like 87%, is not nothing either. And this comes down to the question of whether or not marginal notes are even helpful for those who don't really understand the issues related to textual criticism. So again, I'm not going to touch on that conversation again. We did that before, but they end up being rather misleading. So most people, I think, who are not aware of the textual critical issue would just look at this passage, see that it's in the body of the text, and be like, okay, it's part of Scripture, regardless, if there's square brackets or not. So what's interesting, though, is if you go to Luke, so Matthew 18:10, let me go back to the, where are we here? Let me close some of these tabs here. So if we go to, what's the net say? I'd be curious about the note in the Net Bible here. This will be interesting. I haven't looked at the note in the Net Bible. So let's go to verse 11. There's 10. There's 12. So again, it skips 11. And footnote 14. This is going to be a big note. I know it. All right, here you are. The most important manuscript. The most important manuscripts. That's funny. The most important manuscripts. That's funny. Aleph, B, L. L is interesting because L has a corrector in there, which is writing in the same unsealed script. So it's potentially that the scribe who put the note in there may have been the same scribe who wrote it. Again, I don't know entirely. I'm not technically a textual scholar, but there are some things that we can look at. Theta is interesting. Family 1 and 13 are relatively late. Now, I don't necessarily think that having a late manuscript is necessarily a bad thing. But when you take a look at what Bruce Metzger is saying in his commentary, this is interesting that F1 and 13 are cited here. 33, 892 corrector. And then we have, I think this is the Latin. I'm not sure what E is. Family 1 again, the Syriac, Syriaconian. And I think this is the Sahidic Egyptian, Coptic manuscript. Don't include 1811, for the Son of Man came to save the lost. The verses included, though, in D, L marginal, we'll take a look at that. Washingtoniensis, somebody mentioned that here. Theta corrector, 078. Majority, the Latin, I think the Old Latin, the Latin Latina has it also. The Syriac, the Syriaconian, the Philoxenia, the Herculean also contain it. And then, but it is almost certainly not original, being borrowed, as it were, from the parallel in Luke 19:10. Now, again, I have an issue with that because the verses are not the same. You would think they are based on what everyone's saying here, but the reality is they're not. They're slightly different. And if this is going to be a harmonization, we would expect them to be exactly the same. So there's a sense in which the old proverbial adage that you can have your cake and eat it too, or you can't have your cake and eat it too, is kind of happening here with this, because part of the what do you call it? The criticism against 1 John 5, 7, and 8, for example. There are three that bear record in heaven: the Father, the Word, the Father, the Spirit, and the Word. Or you know what I mean? These three are one. That passage is often cited as saying, well, the order of the words is mixed up. So it's not an exact replica as we see in the TR. Now, again, I'm not a TR guy, so I'm not necessarily beholden to hold in this, 1 John 5, 7, and 8. But the point I'm making here is you can't argue that 1 John 5, 7, and 8 have a different order of words than, say, the early church fathers, and then come over here to Matthew 18:11, which is slightly different from Luke 19:10, and then say, well, see, these ones are slightly different. These ones are, it's a harmonization here. I don't see that working. Again, we'll get into Metzger's thing there. The present translation follows the NA in omitting the verse number as well, a procedure also followed by a number of other modern translations, and we've pointed that out. So here we go. So Matthew 18:11. Now it's, let me come back here. Let's pull up, let's do Luke. We'll come back here. Luke 19:10. And I want you to notice the difference here. This is key. So it says, "For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which is lost." Okay, this is the supposed, the parallel passage in Luke 19:10. I don't have an issue with calling it a parallel passage because it kind of is, with the exception of this phrase here, to seek. So, for the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which is lost. To seek is not in Matthew 18. Where was that? Matthew 18:11. It's not there. So the verses are slightly different. Now, if you're going to argue for a harmonization here, that the writer of Matthew, he was harmonizing against Luke 19, then it seems in my mind that it would have to be identical. I mean, if you've memorized Luke 19:10, and you know it off by heart, which I'm sure some of these scribes know this passage and stuff, they would know it off by heart. If they're going to harmonize it, they're going to add the entire passage. They're not going to leave something out. That's just the nature of remembering something. At least in my mind, when I memorize something, I memorize the whole thing. I don't cut out chunks of it. And it's not going to be very likely that a harmonization is going to occur with bits of that missing. It's strange. And there seems to be some evidence of that being the case. Not the harmonization, but in the manuscript tradition, we're going to see evidence that the harmonization likely didn't occur. And I'll explain to you that a little bit later. All right. So what is going on here? Why is this verse missing? Why is this verse missing? So the verse, if we take a look at the critical texts, all of them don't have it. There's no question about it. Okay, whether you go the Westcott and Hort, the Westcott and Hort text had it, but it's interesting. None of the other ones do. Now I should have dove a little bit deeper into the Westcott and Hort text because I think it's probable they left a footnote. Maybe if one of the eager guys in the comments could take a look at that, you could probably find out if there's a footnote or something there. But we don't have it in the Nestle-Aland text. We don't have it in the SBL text. We don't have it in the THG&T, the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. None of them contain it. But then when you come over to the majority text, so the Textus Receptus, the Byzantine Text, the Hodges Farstad, the F35, the Antoniades, they all have it without question. So it's definitely a Byzantine reading. That's it, a Byzantine reading for sure. All right, so 1811. This is Metzger's commentary. This is what he says. He says, there can be little doubt that the words ilthen garoios to anthropou zitise ke zosose to apollos are spurious. And then he says, here being omitted by the earliest witnesses representing several text types, Alexandrian, Pre-Caesarean, Egyptian, Antiochian, and manifestly borrowed by copyists from Luke 19:10. The reason for the interpolation was apparently to provide a connection between verse 10 and verse 12 to 14. Now, when he says the reason for the interpolation was apparently to provide a connection between verse 10 and verse 12 to 14, it's pure speculation. There's just nothing out there that says, well, this is why this passage is here. In fact, that's a replacement for why we would think the passage would be there was because it's original and it's copied down through the ages. But nonetheless, he says it's omitted by the earliest witnesses representing several text types, Alexandrian, Pre-Caesarean, Egyptian, and Antiochian. I'm not sure what Pre-Caesarean is, but the Caesarean text type doesn't contain it. There are, however, some, I think it was the Bahiric that contains it. It's a little bit later than some of the other Egyptian witnesses, but not by much, the Alexandrian is clearly referencing Aleph and B. And if this is the way it's going to be, and we're going by the earliest witnesses, I think Aleph and B is what would have pushed it off into the not part of Scripture discussion in modern criticism. Yeah, I can't go there. So when he's saying earliest, I think really what's happening is we're talking about Aleph and B. Yes, and then the last thing here is he said it's manifestly borrowed by copyists from Luke 19:10. So this is his explanation of why it's not original, and his explanation of how it got into the textual tradition, because it was borrowed. It was a harmonization with Luke 19:10. But the question is it a harmonization of Luke 19:10? Now we already noted the differences between Luke 19:10 and Matthew 18:11, which was the portion that says to seek was from Luke 19, and Matthew 18 doesn't contain that. It just says to save, not to seek and to save, but to save. And what's interesting is if you look at variations within Matthew 18, 11, this is what happens. Let me pull this up here. Yeah, so here's the verse in Greek. Ilthe gar hoios to anthropou sose to apollolos. This is Matthew 18:11. Now, if I grab my pen, I can show you some interesting things here. So right here, we'll just draw an arrow down here. There's another textual variation here. It's zisite, zisite. This is trying to write with a mouse. Okay, K. And then there's one other textual variant here, and it's here. So ho, which is the article, the word the, in Codex Delta, okay, it's not there. Okay, it's stricken out. And there's actually a really good reason for that. It's reasonable to suggest why Delta doesn't have that. Now, when we take a look at all of the manuscript evidence, we have witnesses which contain it. Most Vulgate and Vetus Latina manuscripts contain it. And then Codex D. So we're going to take a look at Codex D. Now, Codex D is a 5th century manuscript. So this is the earliest manuscript that we have containing Matthew 18, 11. Right here. Ilthen gar hoios to anthropou, so the Son of Man, came to save, sose to apollolos, lost. Okay, so it's in there. Like, there's no footnotes, there's no correctors. It's nothing. It's original. It looks like there might have been some re-inking done as well. So it's in there, like without question. It's in Codex D, a 5th century manuscript. So we have it there. Now, if we take a look at Codex L, let me just find the link here. Yeah, let's go to Codex L, because Codex L is very interesting. Okay, so this is GA19. This is Codex L. This is the interesting one. So it's listed by Metzger as not having any support at all. Well, it's just listed as not having support for Matthew 18:11. So the Son of Man came to save those who were lost. So we'll come down here. So again, right here. Now this is interesting. The footnote's in here. Now the only difference here is if we come back to our snipping text here, it's got everything here except for K. This is not in the footnote. Okay, so we just cross that out. We'll cross that out. It just has zisite sose. Now I suspect, now again, just total speculation. I suspect the reason why the footnote doesn't contain K is because he's squeezing it in there and maybe just couldn't fit. As you can see, there's a note here at the bottom pit here. What's interesting to note about this footnote is the marginal note is that it's written in the same sort of uncial hand, just smaller. You can see some of these letters. Again, it may be hard for you to see because it's going to be really small on your end, but you can see that the style with which the letters are written in are a very similar style as to what it is in the main text. Now, does that mean that the same scribe wrote that marginal note in kind of like, oh, shoot, I forgot this, I meant to put it in? Or did someone come in later and write that in? I don't know. It's just, this is what we have. So we do know that whoever wrote that marginal note in did so before the minuscule manuscript. So it would have been before the 9th century. And seeing as this manuscript specifically, I think it was a 8th century. Let me just check my notes here. Yeah, this one was an 8th century. Even if it was a 9th century hand that put that note in there, it's still relatively earlier within that decent time frame. So L, I don't know if we could consider L to be a witness for either or. So again, when we say that manuscript L doesn't contain it, that's not entirely true. So it seems there's a little bit more stacking up for this passage than would seem to indicate. So let's move on here. Codex K. Let me pop this guy up here. And this one is another 9th century uncial. It's amazing how many uncials there are that support this passage. So if we come back down to Matthew 18:11, okay, and again we have it here. I mean, this is nothing too crazy. Let me see if I can catch it here. There we go. Yilthengar ho Weos. There's the nomina sacra. It's so hard to read. To, weos, to, anthropon, anthropu, right? Again, nomina sacra. In fact, I think there was an issue with the transcribing on this. They didn't include the nomina sacra, but it did in an earlier, interesting. Anyway, so you have it there, as we see it in the Textus Receptus and as we see it in the Byzantine text. And then this one is interesting. Okay, GA 37. It's 8th century. It's a little older than this one. This is the interesting one because this is, if you come back to our, let me just pull this up here. If you come back to our little snippet here, remember how I said this here was a textual variant, the removal of the article. That's basically the word the. They use it in situations. We don't, and it's usually not a huge deal. And in this case, I don't think it's necessarily a huge deal anyway, because we know who weos to anthropu is. But there was one manuscript that had a textual variant where it had excluded the article here, and it's this one here in GA 39 or GA 37, which is Codex Delta, Codex Sangellensis. So if we come down to Matthew 18:11, there it is. Now, this is not like any manuscript you ever seen. Why? Because this manuscript is actually an interlinear. So we have Latin on the top and Greek on the bottom. And this is a script I found kind of difficult to read as well. Now, I'm not sure if this is like a true interlinear where it's just a Latin word above the Greek one and they're not necessarily in order. The Greek is in order. It's a Greek-based text, and maybe they just put the equivalent Latin word over top. I don't know Latin. That's the problem. So I'm looking to remedy that. But in the meantime, there is our passage here. Ilthen, gar, huios, to anthropu, for the Son of Man came. The Son of Man came, right? It doesn't say the, though. It says for Son of Man came to save the lost. So why does this one not have the article before Son of Man? Well, it's really simple. Really simple. Because Latin doesn't have articles. Latin doesn't have a definite article. So what happens here is whoever is writing this manuscript down is probably going to make those mistakes here and there where they forget to put an article in Greek because it doesn't have it in Latin. So I think the Latin-Greek connection gives us a really good, reasonable explanation of why this manuscript doesn't have the article. So that explains, at least in my mind, that explains why the article is omitted here. So those two variants, again coming here, zisate, K, and ho being removed, are explainable. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Okay, so this here, zisate K, and seeking. Oh, here, let me just, there we go. Let's clean that up a little bit. Zisate K, to seek and to save. Most manuscripts don't have that. In fact, there's only, let me take a look at my notes here. There's only 3 manuscripts, two Greek. So we have 579, 892C. They're minuscules. They're very late. And then we have I believe that's one Syriac and one Bohairic, which contains zisate K and nothing else. So here's the thing. This is why this is interesting, because at least in my mind, what this does is it takes Metzgers' explanation of how this verse got into the textual tradition, right, based on a modern eclectic reasoning, and I think it squashes it. And here's why I think it squashes it, because if your reasoning is going to be that it's a harmonization from Luke 19:10, then what you got is you've got this entire verse memorized in mind, including zisate K. And then you write that down because that's what you memorize and that's what you're harmonizing from Luke 19:10. But because basically the majority of all manuscripts that we have in Greek don't contain zisate K, means, at least in my mind, means that it's not a harmonization. And the evidence of this is, while there were a few people who harmonized this verse by adding zisate K in 579 and 892, Syriac and Coptic, again, that's what the harmonization looks like, is this here, zisate K. But when you take zisate K out, it's no longer a harmonization anymore. We could argue that, yeah, they're very similar, and so because they're similar, they have to be harmonized. but then you can't use the harmonization argument anymore, right? And again, the harmonization argument comes down to like the fathers when they're quoting 1 John 5:7 and the argument that, well, 1 John 5:7, it appears in different orders. Well, that you can't use that if you're going to use a harmonization here with it missing this passage. So that's that's some of my reasoning there. Now, where were we here? So Bruce Metzger's argument that this is and this isn't just Bruce Metzger. I think a number of people have claimed it to be a harmonization with Luke 19:10. Again, I suppose it could be, it's possible, but then the question is, well, is it probable? And then when we start talking about probabilities and stuff, I think we sort of lose the conversation. This is why I don't particularly like those kinds of arguments when it comes to trying to explain a variant away. Like, again, said manifestly borrowed by copyists from Luke 19:10 because it's similar. Does that mean it's borrowed? He's making an assumption here. And again, the reason for the interpolation, you get when you try to figure out why something is occurring, this is where it gets very subjective, because if you're going to claim that a specific passage is not part of the scripture, or that it's maybe part of it, you got to explain why. And so he's in a position where he has to explain how this passage, if he believes it's not part of scripture, how it got into the tradition. And his reason is, one, that it's a harmonization with Luke 19:10. We've gone over that a million times. And then it's also in there apparently to provide a connection between verse 10 and verse 12 to 14. Again, this is nothing but speculation. This is just saying, well, I don't see it as part of the original. I got to explain it. So here's how I'm going to explain it. Again, I would put very little stock in those reasons. And given that we see that it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have to be a harmonization, it may not be. All right, so the ones which don't contain it. Okay, so let's talk about the manuscripts which don't contain it. So first off the bat, I'm not going to bring them up and show them to you, but Aleph and B, they do not contain the passage. They don't contain 8 and 11. I think this is the reason when he says being omitted by the earliest witnesses. Okay, we're talking about Aleph and B. I mean, that's essentially it. If Aleph and B weren't in the picture, I don't think that it would swing this way in the modern textual critical world. I think if Aleph and B were not here, then we would include this based on some of these unseals, like because then Codex D, I'm highlighting it on the screen that you're not looking at. Codex D would then be the earliest. And what are we going to change it for Codex D? No, we would take the other stuff in consideration, right? We'd be looking at other unseals. We would be looking at some of the minuscule families and all these sorts of things. And again, the vast majority contains this passage. So we're going to use this passage. In fact, even in the Byzantine text form, the 2005 edition, where the marginal notes appear, there's no marginal note there because it's securely a Byzantine reading. So it contains a tremendous amount of support. I wish I had I wish I had some information on the early fathers that might be enlightening as well. Now there is a manuscript, GA39, Codex K. Again, it's not available online, but you can look up the wiki on this one. And the wiki is interesting because it says that this manuscript is Byzantine in the Gospels, and then Caesarean in other places. Now, what's even more interesting is when you consider that it's a mixed manuscript. So when it comes to those four, Western, Byzantine, Alexandrian, Caesarean, those four kind of historical divisions, when it's mixed, it contains more than one of those. Now, Luke and John in Codex Theta, Codex Koradethi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Luke and John are apparently Byzantine in this manuscript, but only barely Byzantine. And then the Gospel of Mark is Caesarean, And then Matthew's, now this word's interesting. Matthew chapter 1 to 14 is considered barely Byzantine. Okay, I got a quote here, barely Byzantine, but then I guess we would surmise from the fact that the rest of it's not in there, that would mean Matthew 18 would be Caesarean in this passage, and Matthew 18 is not contained. So the Byzantine text, again, contains, or at least this passage is the Codex Theta, Codex Coridethi, would not contain Matthew 18:11, and it wouldn't be Byzantine. So we know that. So here's a quote. So in 2007, the German Bible Society edited the Gospel according to John in the Byzantine tradition. Codex Coridethi is cited in the apparatus and says, Manuscript 38 represents a text on the boundary of what might reasonably be considered a manuscript of the Byzantine tradition in John. So because we don't have the Byzantine text in Matthew 15 to the end of the book, we can surmise that it's not there because it's got Caesarean influence. So again, interesting. We already talked about Codex L, how it's cited as not containing the passage, but with that marginal note there, you can rewind the video and go back to where we talked about that. And then there's two families of manuscripts. So there's family 1 and family 13. So family 1 is a small group of manuscripts. I think there's like 10 or so manuscripts in that, and they are dated from the 12th to the 15th century. So it's interesting to me that this would be included as not having, as evidence of not being 811, even though 1811, even though they're very late. Right. They're 12th to 15th century. I don't know of many textual critics today that would put much weight on a 12th to 15th century manuscript. Again, family 13, which is contains, again, another 10 manuscript or so in that family, from the 11th to the 15th century, so 100 years earlier. And it's characterized by its placement of the pericope adulterae. So family 13 contains the story of the woman caught in adultery in the book of Luke instead of in John. It's interesting again that this would be used as support. I guess technically it is support, but it would be fairly weak in my mind. But nonetheless, it's strong in the textual criticism. Maybe it's not strong. Maybe it's just cited as another piece of evidence. And then, of course, Codex L, we've talked about that. I think that's pretty much it as far as Luke 19:10, Matthew 18 to 11.